Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Technical Workshop number 2. My name is Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and today I'm joined here by James Verdes, who will be our policy developer for this initiative. Today, we will also be joined by Michael Calderoller, and he will also be helping out with this presentation throughout the meeting. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping rules, as this call is being recorded for informational purposes only and will be posted to the YouTube shortly next week. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And also, we are structuring this meeting in order to engage any dialogue or questions. So throughout the meeting, you're welcome to raise your hand using the raise hand icon above your chat window and submit questions through the chat. Please make sure to state your name and affiliation before speaking, so that way we can make sure who's speaking or asking the question. As another reminder, for those who are only in audio only, press #2 on your device in order for us to know who's asking a question. But if you do have any questions or need technical assistance, feel free to ask myself or Silas, my event producer, who will be here to assist. But other than that, we will get things started. And for just a reminder, as those who are on the stakeholder process, we are currently on proposal development phase. So currently, we haven't really started on this other items, but right now we have posted the issue paper. Our goal is to do the straw proposal, and then after that, the following other policy-driven papers. But this is just a timeline of giving you guys an idea where we're heading, but we're in the very beginning, so that's a great start. And for today's agenda, just give a quick overview. It's just going to be mostly examples, but this is really up to you to ask questions. So anytime, please raise your hand and ask any questions. But other than that, I'll kick things off to James to head this direction for this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy holidays. So just to get us kicked off in terms of what we plan to discuss in this workshop, this is the second in a series of technical workshops that are intended to be educational to provide stakeholders with a foundational understanding of price formation principles and mechanics within our market. And particularly in today's session, we are going to be discussing fast start pricing elements, building off of the examples that we did in the first workshop, and discussing price formation mechanics as it relates specifically to fast start pricing. So the second bullet explains that while in this presentation we'll be discussing the implementation of fast start pricing, how it works, and the price formation mechanics associated with it, it does not mean that the CAISO has made the decision to do so. So again, the purpose of these workshops are informational and educational, so that when we do begin the policy development for this initiative, stakeholders are up to speed on the price formation principles and mechanics that we're looking to achieve. Finally, the third bullet explains that we are planning to have a third workshop in this series that will extend the examples from today even further to include some more interesting elements of price formation and its relationship with fast start pricing as it relates to multi-interval dispatch, which the CAISO real-time market has and the Western EIM utilizes, and also the flexible ramping product, which again is a feature of the CAISO's real-time market and the Western EIM. So after workshop 3, we feel like we would be in a good place to sort of begin the policy development around fast start pricing. And at that point, we think stakeholders will, have the information that they need to contribute to this stakeholder initiative successfully. I will note before moving on to the next slide that the previous workshop, there were several stakeholders that requested potentially an educational workshop on scarcity pricing, which we are considering. At this time, we are not, we don't have one planned, but we are trying to see if we have room within our stakeholder calendar to see if we can fit that in before issuing a straw proposal. So I hope you find these useful, and let's get into the material. Next slide, please. Actually, I apologize, but before I talk about slide 7, I also wanted to make sure the audience is aware. I'm joined on the panelists, as a panelist with Michael Cadwalader, who I introduced to the audience last week, last workshop. Michael is helping us at the CAISO with our price formation initiative, and particularly his expertise in fast start pricing is going to be really helpful for us as we start policy development. So thanks, Mike, for joining us. And Mike's going to be providing some color commentary today. Thanks again, Mike, for joining us.
Welcome.
All right, let's start on slide 7. So before we get into the examples, I have a couple slides to refresh our understanding of fast start pricing generally. So this slide takes a couple of phrases from the FERC NOPR on fast start pricing that was issued in December 2016. The price formation issue paper explained that back in 2016, FERC issued a NOPR to investigate whether fast start pricing for the ISOs within its jurisdiction to investigate fast start pricing, whether it would improve price formation within the ISOs. So I took a couple of nuggets from that NOPR that hopefully will help provide some context for this discussion. First of all, the first bullet explains that you first have a set of fast start resources that, because of their inflexible minimum and maximum operating limits, are often not eligible to set the locational marginal price. So in our examples from the previous workshop, we tested this and showed when we made one of the units have sort of a small dispatch range that oftentimes, given the incremental demand that's needed, that unit may not be able to set the price. And instead, we need to dispatch those units to oftentimes to their minimum output, and then dispatch another unit, down to meet the actual incremental demand. And because of that, the price is set by the resource that's moving, and not the fast start resource, which can have put downward pressure on the price. So the FERC NOPR intended to realize the fact that these fast start resources are often critical for meeting load in the real time, but because of their operating constraints, they're not often eligible to set the price. The second bullet explains the concept of commitment costs included within the price. And the argument that FERC made and others may have made is that, because fast start resources are typically committed in the real time close to the interval when they're actually needed to produce energy, that arguably the cost to commit these units is incurred because the cost to commit these units is incurred roughly at the same time as the incremental costs, that arguably those commitment costs should be included within the LMP. And so that's going to be part of the context of our discussion today, in which we'll demonstrate how that might look to include the commitment cost of a fast start resource into the actual price. We saw in the last workshop that it can be the case where the market has to rely on uplift payments to compensate resources for the commitment cost of being part of the market, because the fixed costs of a resource are not part of the locational marginal price. So that's sort of the background there. Then the last thing here, fast start pricing is designed generally to recognize that fast start resources are, for all intents and purposes, the marginal resource used to meet the next increment of energy or operating reserve demand. And so the word in that sentence that's doing the most work, in my opinion, is the word marginal. The fast start pricing recognizes the scheme where the concept of marginal is expanded beyond sort of the calculus definition of marginal, and more towards if you're starting a resource and it's being dispatched to meet demand in the next interval, then I guess the fast start pricing argument is that that is the resource that you're relying on to meet the next increment of demand, even though technically from a calculus perspective, it's not able to set the marginal price because of its limited dispatch range. So I believe within the issue paper, we've linked to the original FERC NOPR document if anybody is interested in learning more about FERC's motivation to have the ISO RTOs within its jurisdiction investigate fast start pricing. Okay, let's move to the next slide. For the audience, I will be monitoring, and Brenda and Silas will help me monitor for hands. So please feel free if you want to have a question or make a comment to raise your hand, and I will pause at the end of the slide to allow you to speak. Okay, so as we move into the examples, we have sort of the FERC background. There's really two main components of fast start pricing that we need to discuss. First is the concept of minimum output limit relaxation. So what that means is that prices are set as though a fast start resource can be dispatched across their entire capacity range by reducing their minimum operating limit to 0. So the minimum operating limit in CAISO jargon, you might hear it referred to as P-min. So we saw from workshop 1 when we had a unit that had a small dispatchable range, meaning its P-min and P-max are relatively close together. That resource has a difficult time setting the price unless the incremental demand happens to be within that dispatchable range. By relaxing the minimum operating limit of a resource, you allow it, at least in the pricing run, to be considered by the optimization to be marginal and set the price. So the second sentence there says, this makes it easier or possible for the resource to become the marginal generator and set the price. So I put easier or possible because it's not impossible that a fast start resource sets the price, but unless it's completely block loaded, meaning that its P-min and P-max are exactly the same, or they'd have only one operating level, but certainly easier in the extent that if that operating range is real small, they have to sort of have the incremental demand be within that small range for them to set the price. So the second concept is inclusion of commitment costs within pricing. We'll see in the examples that, we saw in the examples from workshop 1 that the marginal prices do not incorporate commitment costs. They only incorporate the incremental energy costs. And so fast start pricing seeks to have methods in which commitment costs can be included within the marginal price, such that the marginal price incorporates things like startup and minimum load costs and sort of fully represent the incremental cost of starting the unit to meet demand. Okay, next slide. So a few other considerations to think of before we move into the examples. First, it's important to note that fast start pricing requires that the unit commitment and dispatch process and the pricing process be determined through 2 separate market runs. So the subbullet explains that the CAISO market already has 2 separate processes of this nature. We have a scheduling run and a pricing run. The scheduling run determines the awards or dispatches, and the pricing run then determines the associated prices. So the CAISO market already has the features to be able to accommodate this. The reason why this is true is because, of course, if you are, we need the actual scheduling of the resource to follow the resource's physical operating characteristics. And if you were to relax the minimum output of a resource down to 0 in the scheduling run might actually give that resource a dispatch or a schedule that it's not physically capable of doing. And so why that's important is that really only the pricing run of the market process is affected by the fast start pricing, so that you have scheduling run dispatches that actually, the resource is actually physical capable of providing, but the pricing run makes different assumptions about its abilities and changes the price. Second, a fast start resource's supply curve must be defined differently in the pricing run than the supply curve used in the scheduling run. So that's because, again, in the scheduling run, you want to make sure that the supply curve that's being used within the scheduling run considers the resource's actual operating characteristics, but the supply curve used in the pricing run is modified such to extend the fast start pricing features into the market pricing. So two sub-bullets on that point. One is that the modified supply curve that's used in the pricing run must continue to be monotonically non-decreasing. So that's already a feature of bidding in the CAISO market, and probably for all markets, that you need to have offers that as the megawatt quantity increases, the price increases, and so you don't have non-decreasing offers, which would add in complexity or convexity into the market solution. Second, that it's important that in the second sub-bullet there, the cost of running the unit at its maximum output, or PMAX in the CAISO jargon, must be the same when using the modified supply curve as when using the actual supply curve. Otherwise, the market will have made the unit more or less expensive than it should be in the pricing run. So it's important to make sure that the modification of the supply curve follows best practices in terms of setting it so that you maintain convexity and have and at the same time make sure that the costs aren't misrepresented, such that you sort of change the efficient dispatch of the market. So I see two hands on these points. So I saw Alva's hand first, and then we'll move to Dan.
Very good. I'm sure Dan will have better questions than me. I'm just wanted to sort of, I'm still trying to think through this as I read your slides, but it seems that basically the pricing run, as is the current pricing run, is essentially a linear program, but in the new construct, there's more freedom in the solution of the linear program, because essentially you let and yes, sorry, Brenda, this is Alvis Voda from PG&E. Thank you. There's the ability to move the constrained generation resource, now known as a constrained generation resource, down below its Pmin into the range where it can't actually operate. But that also means as it moves down there, other resources are also moving into it, because you're still balancing against the same load, I'm assuming. Other resources are also moving in their solutions. How strong the assumptions have to be as to how close you are for this to be valid? Because certainly if you move far enough away from the scheduling run solution, you could have prices that have very counterintuitive effects or incentive effects in terms of what they would be telling resources to, essentially how they're being priced. I don't know exactly how to get at my area of distrust, but it just seems to me like the solution potentially can change in ways that make the pricing run not very accurate as an indication of in its correspondence to the scheduling run.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and Mike can feel free to weigh in here too. My first reaction to your question is that the examples will assume that the relaxation of the minimum output allows the fast start resource in the example to set the price. It's not a guaranteed thing necessarily that a fast start resource, even within fast start pricing, becomes the marginal generator
Right.
that sets the price. It obviously makes it more likely, or even possible, You know, I'm not sure to the extent that it can drive, you know, really erroneous, potentially erroneous prices in the pricing run. I'd imagine that, you know, for the, you know, we learned in the issue paper, hopefully, that, you know, different ISOs have different restrictions on how conservatively they set the definition of a fast start resource, where you might have some ISOs that say they have to start within 15 minutes. Some ISOs say they have to start within an hour. So it does seem to me that one thing to consider is that as you increase the quantity of resources that fall under the definition of fast start and thus are modeled differently for pricing, that you probably, if there are unintended consequences like you're concerned about, you probably increase the likelihood of them as you increase the set of resources. But I'm curious if Mike has anything to add to my response.
Yeah, no, I think that was, I agree with what you said, James. I mean, I think that, you know, in a situation where we got perhaps a number of fast start resources operating, it's going to be important to have, well, let's put it this way. If the prices aren't reflecting the operation of those resources, then there's an argument to be made on the other side, essentially, that, you know, setting prices in the current way is consistent with the fact that I have a whole bunch of fast start resources operating at costs that are, you know, presumably well above the price that is being set under the current mechanism. So I think, you know, either way, you know, if you were to have it's a reasonable question. Don't get me wrong, but I think that, you know, it depends on exactly how you look at it. If you set the price one way, you can say, gee, price is not reflecting the fact that we are starting these fast start resources and they are actually needed to be load at this particular point in time and should be considered eligible to set the price. So that would be the argument that goes the other direction. But it's a fair question to ask. I think that, you know, at least in my personal experience, and you know, which is, you know, primarily associated with the implementation of fast start pricing in New York, that it has not has not actually been a significant problem, that we have essentially the pricing and the physical dispatches being completely out of whack with each other. You know, it's that hasn't really been something that's.
I was curious about this. Sort of reminds me of an approach to solving the unit commitment problem that was around 40 years ago, called Lagrangian relaxation, where essentially there was an attempt to find a set of prices that would yield the right commitment in the system. And the basic problem with it is that the prices don't really yield an optimal commitment. And I'm wondering if maybe one way to control this would be to have some sort of metric on a duality gap that it gives you some assurance that the prices are still consistent within some tolerance of optimality. Anyway, this is just an area that I'm a little concerned about with this development. Thank you. Appreciate your comments, both of you.
Thanks, Alba. Dan next, and then Josh Arnold in the queue as well. Hey, Dan.
Hey, James. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. The one between Alba and Josh is somewhat dangerous for the quality of my question. I am just thinking in the additional consideration sense, when we're working on some of these proposals, about trying to tie it back to the grid that we expect to exist when they would be in place, and thinking about where these resources sit, both in the EIM, EDAM context and on the CAISO system. And I'm just curious if while we're thinking about fast start pricing, shortage pricing, some of the other things, that we also need to be cognizant of any limitations that the current market power mitigation framework, as well as the commitment cost bidding framework and reference level updates and those sorts of things that are very impactful to these specific resources. Like, if you would need to, in order to truly get to representing those resources in the market during certain conditions, whether you would also need to revisit some of the policies around local market power mitigation and commitment costs, so that you would make sure that these resources true costs are fully being able to be reflected, including their opportunity costs being fully reflected in the market pricing that they're now able to be a part of.
Yeah, without a doubt, I think that's part of the consideration. I think you know, we put in the issue paper, you know, maybe in the opposite direction of your suggestion, that we were not necessarily inclined to sort of revisit sort of the I don't remember exactly how we phrased it, and I wasn't part of the CCW stakeholder process, but I know there have been some calls for reopening, looking into like market-based, you know, bids for commitment costs rather than having them as, you know, parameters. But I think, and market power is actually one that I personally didn't really see that the connection until you brought it up, but yeah, potentially there would be some market power mitigation processes around default bids and other things that may, you know, if we were looking at a new pricing scheme, may have to be adjusted to accommodate what the pricing results of something like fast start pricing might look like. You know, I think we could use prior ISO's experiences to help us guide, you know, what direction, looking at how they've been implementing these things to help us. But yeah, I definitely see the connections to both the things you brought up.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from a very practical perspective of spending some time looking into, you know, which resources would this sort of new policy apply to, where are they located, are they resources that are currently subject to frequent mitigation during tight system conditions? Are they, when, you know, this sort of a policy would generally have a larger impact, are they usually being mitigated during that time? And then also, you know, spending some time with the community that's doing their bidding to, that came out wrong, submitting their bids, to understand if they have questions or concerns about the you know, the commitment cost framework. That also would need to be addressed to just kind of get it all together as one, you know, impactful policy if we're going to spend the time working through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
so
all I
I
got.
mean,
Thank you.
yeah, and I applaud the questions, and you know, as usual, your questions get at sort of some of the high level connections. It's obviously beyond the scope of what we're going to discuss in this particular workshop, but gives me some, you know, food for thought to take back to the team, see what we can, you know, come up with on those lines. Let's hear from Josh.
Good afternoon at this point. Josh Arnold, PG&E. Well, first off, thank you, Dan, for setting up and asking. One of my questions was about the incorporation of LMPM into this whole process and how commitment costs would be affected by LMPM. That's when we first looked at fast start resource pricing way back when, that was one of the sticking points of how do you truly mitigate and determine whether the commitment costs being used to create the convex hull price, how is that really determined as being accurate, and how do you incorporate that effectively into the DEBs such that you don't have a monotonically decreasing curve at some point? And that was actually a real big problem, because under the current methodology, obviously the commitment costs of the unit are already assumed to be covered if they perform. That's what bid cost recovery is for. So that sort of stands as a pillar that can't really be taken away from the unit. If they get awarded, if they perform, they get their commitment costs plus whatever LMPs. If you start looking at putting all of those commitment costs in over the range of bids, and as you've put in this last bullet here, where you have to really incorporate it over the Pmax of the unit such that the bid point at the Pmax of the range is not affected, well, what you're doing is you're really distorting the price, the value price of that unit at lower ranges. So as you move down from Pmax, either through a redispatch in the scheduling or pricing, from the scheduling to the pricing run, you are going to start seeing some distortions in that price that may still not guarantee that the resource is made whole to its actual costs, especially if it's got a very short bid curve between Pmin and Pmax. So I'm really still very curious as to the urgency and the requirement that this be done, because I still haven't heard what this provides to the market. Obviously, to the supply side, it adds increased prices when these units are called. And that may be economically necessary for some things like transparency and visibility, but from a market perspective, we're still paying, more money for the same product. So I'm putting my load hat on and saying, why would load really be interested in this if that generator is going to make its costs back?
Mm-hmm.
And I do recognize the fast start resources out east, especially in MISO and the like. Yeah, they're very different beasts. There you have fast start resources that are really like steel smelting plants, aluminum smelters that have to shut down, and they do have incredible costs in that process. But when we did the review, at least within California, that wasn't the case for the California fast start resources. We don't have that same level of industry that can shut itself down. I mean, yes, there are indeed some automobile factories and the like, and some refineries that can do so. But for the most part, fast start resources tended to be, I believe, either peaker plants or large scale air conditioning, where the costs were much easier to incorporate and factor in. So I'm still not sure how this all works together and really what we're gaining by doing this.
Yeah, all good questions and comments, and I'm afraid I'm not well equipped to answer them at this moment. But I mean, I hear you, and again, that's why I kind of put that disclaimer on the front slide to say that these slides are the purpose of these workshops is just to get people to try to understand the basics of what fast start pricing is and its price formation. And I promise you that we will have the opportunity to debate, the simple merits of including it, in terms of actually including it within our market as the policy develops. And I am interested now. I mean, I hadn't really thought about, two commenters bringing up the connection with local market power mitigation, and I guess I never really clicked to me that connection there, but that's definitely something worth investigating. So you've given me some more things to look into over the holidays. Appreciate that, Josh.
All right, and one last quick comment, just
sure.
As you mentioned it, I'm also a little bit worried that this might create a diversity of behavior of resources. If fast start resources can incorporate their commitment costs, and say non-fast start resources can't, does that create a problem in the price formation where one unit is treated differently than the other? That's another thing to think about, especially if we define fast start in this case as a very short time frame and doesn't correspond with the fast start of the tariff.
Mm-hmm.
Just some thoughts.
Yep.
But thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. Good discussion. Let's proceed with the examples. I think we'll start the example on the next slide. Okay, so a little bit of setup here. These are the same generator assumptions as in the first workshop. So to review, we're dealing with two generators. One you could consider to be sort of a 200 megawatt baseload resource, and one has a 100 megawatt peaker. In each example, serving 250 megawatts of demand. The only exception to the first bullet is that, in the first workshop, we toggled back and forth of having the second unit having an economic minimum or not. In these examples, the resource will always have an economic minimum of 75 megawatts. So its dispatchable range in these examples will be between 75 and 100 megawatts. Of course, the third bullet, we're assuming that offers reflect actual costs and no market power. So there's nothing silly going on with the bidding. There's no strategic bidding going on. Assume these are just the actual costs, and there's nothing else going on within the bids. Second, for simplification, the startup time of these resources is 0 minutes to make it much simpler in you know, when we commit these units, they're considered to be online immediately, or at least within whatever the next interval we're dealing with here. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to have two examples that are going to, example one is going to describe first the status quo pricing. So this is a repeat of the same example from the first workshop. And we're going to build on only the concept of minimum output relaxation to show how that affects the price and affects which unit in this example sets the price. I will also note that it may not be clear in the slides, but we are going to consider that unit 2 in all of these examples meets the definition of a fast start resource, and unit 1 does not. So you'll see that the concepts of fast start pricing being applied only to unit 2 and not to unit 1. Okay, so we are, both of these units are offline at the time that we're making this dispatch decision. We're trying to solve for 250 megawatts of demand. Unit 2, as I mentioned, is throughout these examples going to have a minimum output of 75 megawatts. The cost of unit 1 is 25, the incremental cost for energy for unit 1 is $25, and the incremental cost of energy for unit 2 is $50. In this example, there's no commitment cost, so we're only thinking about incremental costs. The market operator asks itself, how should we dispatch these units to serve 250 megawatts of demand while minimizing the production costs? So if you move to the next slide. This would be the dispatch that would result that minimizes the production cost given the resource constraints. The previous workshop had this all laid out in tables and stuff. Because this is a repeat of the first workshop, I skipped right just to the answer without the tables. But hopefully you're familiar with the solution that essentially, because we need both units to be online in order to meet the 250 megawatts of demand. In other words, unit 1 would not be able to meet the demand by itself because its capacity is only 200 megawatts. We need unit 2 to be online. But because of its minimum operating constraint, we have to dispatch unit 2 to its PMIN, which is 75 megawatts. And because of that, we only need unit 1, despite it being the cheaper resource, we only need unit 1 to be dispatched to 175 megawatts, which a combination of the two units dispatch equals the demand. So we're satisfied here. Now, because unit 1 is the cheaper resource compared to unit 2, both units have 25 megawatts of operating range left with which incremental demand can be served. So if we were to need an incremental unit, we would get it from unit 1, and unit 1 would set the price at $25. So this is, again, a repeat of the example from the first workshop. And we, at the first workshop, asked ourselves, you know, what happens because unit 2 is being asked to produce 75 megawatts, but the market price is set below its cost. You know, the unit 2 is needing to be paid uplift. You know, if you consider uplift payments just on a one interval basis, unit 2 would require an uplift payment to make them whole to their costs. So let's move to this next slide. Now we're going to add on the concept of minimum output relaxation to this example to see what happens to the prices. So again, when we're introducing the fast start concept here, the examples are going to split between a scheduling run and a pricing run. So again, the scheduling run is going to solve for the optimal dispatch using the offers from each resource as they're submitted, but also maintains the physical operating constraints of each resource and actually finds the exact same optimal solution here of 175 megawatt dispatch for unit 1 and 75 megawatt dispatch for unit 2. And so this would be the actual dispatch instruction sent to the unit, but this run does not calculate the prices that would be set in this market run. So if we go to the next slide, this is what would happen in the pricing run. Now, the dispatch quantities calculated in the pricing run are not binding, meaning that these dispatch instructions are not the ones that are sent to the units to actually follow. But you can see that in the assumption that we were to relax the minimum output of unit 2 such that the market can consider it fully dispatchable between 0 and 100, that the solution would change such that unit 2 would be asked to serve 50 megawatts and unit 1 would be asked to serve the remaining 200. And because of this construction, unit 2 is able to set the price in the pricing run because it's considered marginal across its entire output range. Therefore, the price is actually set by unit 2 at $50 in this example. So to review, the scheduling run determined the optimal dispatch of these units, considering the units' offered costs, and their physical operating constraints. And then in the pricing run, the assumption of the minimum output of unit 2 is relaxed such that unit 2 is now able to set the market price at $50. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to show sort of two different types of curves here to demonstrate a little bit more about what's happening. We mentioned in the beginning that we said that the supply curves of the units actually change between the scheduling run and the pricing run if the resource is modeled differently in the pricing run for pricing purposes. So this is the marginal cost or the supply curve of unit 2. And on the left-hand side, this is the marginal cost represented in the scheduling run, and the right-hand side is the marginal cost represented in the pricing run. So you can see that in the scheduling run that the solid part of the curve between Pmin and Pmax is the only part of the units curve that can actually set the price, and the dashed portion represents sort of inoperable range. But when you go to the pricing run, it changes to the curve in red, where essentially you are solidifying the entire bar between 0 and Pmax, such that the resource can set the price at any level between its Pmin and Pmax. So let's go to the next slide. Another way to think about it is through a total cost curve of the unit. And so this is just adding up the total cost of operating the unit. These are not, the slope of these curves represents the marginal cost. So you can see on the left-hand side that you have an upward sloping cost curve that begins to take value at Pmin and then extends upward to its Pmax. And on the right-hand side in the pricing run, it's essentially taking the same total cost curve, but extending those costs all the way to 0. You notice that the slope of the lines are exactly the same, which means that its marginal cost is the same. It's just giving cost to unit 2 all the way down to 0. Now, this particular total cost curve isn't as interesting as the one that will precede example 2 when we incorporate commitment costs, but it's sort of another way to sort of visualize what is happening with the resource costs between the two market runs. Next slide, please. So let's sort of pause a second to think about the outcome of this example. So the status quo, the dispatch between the status quo and the minimum output relaxation method is exactly the same. You still have 175 megawatt dispatch for unit 1, 75 megawatt dispatch for unit 2. The difference is the market price. So in the status quo example, the market price is set by generator 1 at $25. And in the second example, the market price is set by unit 2 at $50. So we need to pause a sec to think about our pricing principles that we discussed in the first workshop, the third of which stated that prices should incentivize participants to follow their market schedules in dispatch. So the first bullet explains that anytime you have dispatch and pricing processes determined separately, the generators may not have the price incentives they need to follow the dispatch signal. So let's look at the incentives to follow the price for the two units in our example. Unit 1 is dispatched to 175 megawatts, which is below its maximum capacity of 200 megawatts. Its marginal cost is $25 per megawatt hour, but the LMP is set by Unit 2 at $50 per megawatt hour. So it would be profitable for Unit 1, in this case, to ignore the market dispatch and produce at 200 megawatts because it can earn $25 per megawatt hour by not producing at 175, but instead producing at 200. So that's obviously an outcome that we would want to avoid through our pricing. So the third bullet explains that fast start pricing does require the use of opportunity cost payments or financial penalties to incentivize generators not to deviate from their dispatch. So a common way to do this would be, as explained in the sub-bullet, is to find the opportunity costs for this resource and pay them that opportunity cost as a side payment. So for Unit 1, this would be 25 megawatts, which represents the difference between its 175 megawatt dispatch and its 200 megawatt ability, times the price difference between the LMP of $50 and its cost of $25, which results in a $625 side payment. So when you consider the $625 side payment, Unit 1 no longer has an incentive to deviate from their dispatch. So I wanted to, given that, I wanted to turn it to Mike and see if he can describe for us a bit how the New York ISO handles, this sort of issue. So Mike, can you help us out?
Sure. Yeah. So in New York, they do not have these payments that compensate units for a lost opportunity to operate up, in this case, above 175, megawatts for Unit 1. Instead, they adopt the other approach, the penalty-based approach. Effectively, there is some leeway, but the basic rule under the New York ISO's markets is that you're sent a base point which designates the amount of energy you're expected to produce in a given interval. There's a certain amount of leeway, I believe usually 3% of your base point. And if you produce in excess of that, well, that's nice, and that was for free. You're not compensated in it for that. But that's the other approach that's used. So in this case, if you were to go ahead and if this unit was operating in New York and decided it wanted to go to 200 megawatts, the New York ISO would say, well, that's nice, but we're not going to pay you for 200 megawatts. We'll pay you for a little bit more than 175. We'll reflect the fact that, it's not usually possible to hit your base points exactly, but the idea is to, again, as you pointed out, and as is necessary, you can't, essentially, in a system like this, there's going to be incentives such as exist for Unit 1 in this case. Say that, gee, I'd like to run at 200 megawatts, and to the extent that the pricing is going to be giving an incentive like that, it's going to be necessary to put some sort of mechanism in place, whether through an opportunity cost payment or through a rule such as that the New York ISO applies, that would address that incentive.
Thanks, Mike. Okay. Not seeing any. Okay, there we go. Okay, couple hands popped up. I saw Josh first, so let's go ahead, Josh.
All right, Josh Arnold, PG&E again. Okay, so one thing that jumps out immediately to me with this is if we look at the New York style approach of overgeneration is effectively free, I'm worried with how that would mesh with our VER fleet, especially our solars in the middle of the day, because they're tied to a forecast that we all know is maybe accurate most of the time, but not all the time. So there's definitely a concern there that under this approach, with that kind of a protection mechanism, that our solar resources, our wind resources, wouldn't be compensated appropriately for their output, counter to the expectations of the California legislature. I'm also looking at, because as you ran through the numbers, I was tapping them into Excel. The big difference I see in all this, because under the current methodology, we've got bid cost recovery for commitment costs and for market cost, unit costs that aren't covered by the market. Under the example you had under the current system, with the 25 megawatt LMP, unit 1 would get the $25 for their 125 megawatts. Unit 2 would get $25 for 75 megawatts. That's a total market cost of $5,000. Okay, unit 2 is out of the money, but they'd get a BCR payment of $1,875 if they performed as expected. So that's where, in the current market, that's where the barbs are. That's where the incentive is. Do what you're told to do, and you'll be made whole. So in this case, the total cost of the market is $6,875. If we move to the updated mechanism, well, as soon as that LMP jumps up to $50, first off, you're right. The unit 1 now has a incentive to overproduce because it's making money on every megawatt. And unit 2, well, they're still in the same boat, but they're gonna get their full compensation. But the total market costs now are $12,500. No BCR. So we've increased the market cost by $5,625 for these 250 megawatts, and we've taken away the incentive we have to produce by tying the bid cost recovery to production. Instead, we have to claw money back from unit 1, which really may not be appropriate. And unit 1 is going to have they have the incentive to overproduce anyway, because the LMP is $50. It's much higher than the $25 costs. Why wouldn't they do it? So I'm not seeing, I'm looking at this, I'm seeing more money paid out by load, no real benefit to load, and less control over the generator behavior. Just putting that out there, especially once we tie in possible impacts to the Burr resources and the hybrid resources that really are going against forecast, not against a dispatch schedule, the same way that a natural gas turbine may be. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, I do feel like you need to clarify unit 1. The rules that I was describing in New York apply to generators under dispatch. Rules will be different if we're talking about a intermittent power resource that certainly has limited control. It can decrease its output, but it has limited control as far as actually being able to follow its base point.
Okay, and the concern I would have there is now you have different treatment for different resources based on their specific technology type. And at least within California, within the CAISO, there's always been this idea that we should be technology agnostic when putting together these policies and these concepts, so that we aren't subsidizing directly to some resource type. That happens on the regulatory side enough as it is. I don't know that we want the market to really subsidize those resources as well. So I'm just putting that out there as a consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh, for your comments. Jeff Spires, how's it going, Jeff?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, James. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Jeff Spires with PowerX. Do you mind jumping back to page 12 for a moment?
Sure, operator. Can we move back to slide 12?
Slide 12, thank you.
Yes, this is the one. Just the illustration of the result under the status quo. I just wanted to make a high level comment. First of all, I appreciate the discussion and also the examples that get into the mechanics of fast start pricing. It's useful just to make sure we're all on the same page about what the concept is and what it does. But some of the comments and discussions so far have been related to what is the high level objective and what is the benefit of fast start pricing. And I think that's a pretty important point to emphasize. And I think that this example helps to illustrate what fast start pricing is trying to accomplish. Because if you take a step back here, you have two resources and you're trying to meet load. One of them is $25 and the other is $50. And so pretty clearly, the operator is having to dispatch the peaker at a cost of $50 and use that to meet load. And the problem with that under the status quo is that the price signal that's being sent says $25. And the issue there is, imagine that there was a third resource, whether it's an import or some other resource that could be used to meet load in this example that had a cost of, say, $40. I think if you just take a step back, then pretty clearly the preference would be, the more efficient outcome would be to encourage the $40 resource to be used and dispatch that and avoid running the peaker altogether. And so when I think about fast start pricing, I think that what the overarching objective is to better reflect the actual cost of the resources that are being used to meet load, which ultimately sends that appropriate price signal both for the current time frame as well as into the future to say, if you can add supply or make yourself available to displace these gas peakers that are running, particularly in those peak hours, and offer that supply more economically than, in this example, $50, that's what should be happening. And a price signal that only shows, say, $25 is not sending that transparent signal that there's an opportunity here for a more efficient outcome. And so I think that that's really the fundamental case for fast start pricing, is how can we better reflect that marginal cost of meeting load? I think that that's why FERC has taken the view that fast start pricing is a positive step towards doing that, particularly when gas peakers are being used, and why all of the other RTO ISOs in the US have adopted it, because it contributes to better transparency around the cost of meeting load, and ultimately that's the right, what is necessary to have more efficient outcomes both now and into the future. And so I think that that's a valuable discussion to have around the merits of this, in addition to obviously, thinking through the technical details of how it's implemented. But again, fortunately, this is not a theoretical concept. It's been implemented in all of the other markets. And I think, as we've heard from your co-host today, that gives us some valuable insight into how it works in other markets that could be leveraged for the CAISO. Anyhow, thank you. Appreciate the chance to comment.
Thank you, Jeff. Perry?
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, GDS Associates. I just wanted, I think I have 2 or 3 things here. This is a good place for it. First, I wanted to point out that I share Josh Arnold's concern. This is not New York. We have tons of solar. We have tons of wind in the West, and a lot more is coming. So to start to try to penalize VERS for overproducing is an issue. And then to turn around and say, well, we can solve that issue by making discriminatory rules based on resource type, I think is probably unacceptable. Also, maybe we can get somewhere on that. My next point I wanted to make, I'm actually glad Jeff brought it up here because, I think everything that Jeff was talking about just there really falls into one of the principles. And this is a principle that you guys kind of laid out as you put this example out there, and that is, prices should reflect the short-term operational needs of the system and facilitate reliable operation. So you could maybe argue that it's reflecting the short-term operational need, but that's 1 out of 6 principles. So with complicated policies like this one, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, look, this price, is more reflective and it feels better. It's, well, there are also cons to weigh against, and those are reflected in the other five principles that we've worked through in the last workshop. The third point I wanted to make was related to the long-term pricing incentive. And I think a good way to tackle this one that might just help me out here is to imagine, I'm doing an evaluation here on this particular system, and I'm trying to figure out, should I build a resource here? And I think Jeff sort of teed this up nice. So if you could go to the part of the example where you have the pricing under the new paradigm. I forget what slide that is.
Probably 1, 2, no, please move forward in the deck. Maybe slide 14. Yep, here you go.
Yeah, so so just help me understand, you know, if I'm evaluating adding a resource here, and I see under the new paradigm, the $50 price, I might look at this and say, hey, you know, this makes sense. You know, like Jeff said, for me to build a 10 megawatt, you know, $30 marginal cost resource here. And I just want to help, like, I hate to do it on the fly here, but if it seems to me that if I'm adding, you know, maybe a 10 megawatt, $30, $40 resource here, I could go through a pretty heavy investment in building that. But it's not clear that I would actually get a dispatch under this paradigm. So I followed the forward price signal that the CAISO told me. I said it might be economic to build a unit here that has got a marginal cost of less than $50. Yet I think at that size, I think I would be sitting idle still. Am I getting that right on this example?
Sorry, Perry, I was trying to flip through mute. Yeah.
But yeah, sorry. The way I see it is you would still need the minimum of 75 on unit 2, and that would displace any benefit I would get from building a 10 megawatt resource here, because you'd still want to get the rest of the megawatts off of unit 1. And you know, as we think about that, you correct me if I'm wrong on that example, but as I think about that, that really ties in a lot more than just that one principle. It ties in, I think, 2 or 3 of the other principles there. So that's
So if we
that's one of my concerns here, and maybe there's a way around it, but you know, long-term pricing incentives are kind of key here.
Yeah, I think
and it's worth a lot more money than just the $25 price difference here. We're talking about, you know, building new resources.
Thanks, Barry. Sorry for keep cutting you off. Yeah, maybe if we could play with that example here. I mean, it seems to me that if you were a resource that was under 25 megawatts, you would not get a dispatch in this interval, because you would continue, if you're, let's say in your example, if you're a $30 resource, you would use up all the energy from unit 1, and you would go idle, as you said. There's probably a point with which, and this is the danger of doing it on the fly, but I think the resource has to be over, maybe if the resource is between 25 and 50 megawatts, you know, you still need unit 2 to be online to meet the demand, and it's probably still, but it may not be. Oh, I guess it would still be setting the price in that unit. So it kind of does depend on the size of the unit and where it fits into this, you know, these numbers to decide if that unit's actually being asked to run, and if it gets the $50 price. But I guess I see your point that it may not be as predictable as just saying, oh, I'm cheaper than $50. So is that, am I on the right track of kind of where you're trying to take that?
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to really take it anywhere. I just thought, you know, if I think you're right on the numbers here. If I were to invest in building a less than 25 megawatt plant and installing it here with that'll have a marginal cost of $40, I'd never get a dispatch, even though the LMP is telling me that it makes sense to perhaps invest there.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that the fictional third unit would have to be at least 50 megawatts. Once it is, then you would commit it in lieu of unit 2, because it plus unit 1 can meet your 250 megawatts of load. But I mean, you know, So yeah, if it was a 10 megawatt unit 3 at a cost of, let's say, $40, you wouldn't build it. But of course, I understand your point. I think it's well taken, but at the same time, I think we want to be careful about reading too much into, an example like this with us 2 units is going to have these huge non-convexities in it. That can kind of get you to sort of these a little bit unusual outcomes that you might not see. They might occur from time to time, but they might not be situations you'd see commonly more often in units where we have, in examples where we have, first, we don't just have 250 megawatts. That's sometimes the load is 240, sometimes it's 260, sometimes it's 280, and we also have a lot more units that can meet the load. I mean, I think your point's correct, but I think it also applies to a situation where we have just 2 units and just 1 level of load.
I'm sorry, what was that last point about 1 level of load?
Just 2 units and just 1 level of load. If we go ahead and even this 2-unit example, if we start considering some hours of more or less, we're going to probably get into some situations where it makes sense to go ahead and actually run that 10 megawatt unit you're talking about.
Right. This example is one interval, two resource. I think in my experience, if something starts to not make sense on the simplest example possible, then that's an indication of something. But I'm glad to hear that I kind of looked at this one the right way, that I could invest a lot of money in building a resource there that would sit idle. In this, I'll correct it. In this interval, it would be sitting idle. I think that just kind of gets to, we got to be careful about price ambiguity. And today it's clear, beat $25 and you're going to get a dispatch. Under this design, it's beat 50 and you may or may not get a dispatch. At least in this interval, I'll correct my example there. So I could see that the argument, there's some room between 25 and 50 for some efficiency gain if all of the stars align on the unit that I build. I'm just kind of attracted to today's world where I can run an 8760 price and start doing an analysis to see if I'm going to get my ROI based on the LMPs without needing to consider any of these other things. I'll stop there for now, though. But thanks for the time.
Thank you, Perry. And I see a couple hands in the queue. Maybe if I can ask Jeff, or I saw Jeff's hand pop back up. He may want to respond, and then we'll go to Josh and Petter, and then we'll move on to the next example. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks, James. Jeff Spires with PowerX again. I don't need to belabor it. It's probably obvious, but I mean, I don't think that longer term or that investment decisions are made based on a single interval or a single example. I think, though, that what it helps to do is just illustrate what we're at a high level talking about and thinking about, which in my mind is trying to accurately reflect that marginal cost. And so it's not about a single interval as much as it's about saying, okay, if over time these peakers are running on a regular basis and the prices in the market don't reflect the cost of those resources, then you're sending a price signal over the longer term that doesn't really truly reflect the cost of meeting load, and it doesn't truly reflect an opportunity for another resource, perhaps a new technology like batteries or something else, to come in and allow the market to be more efficient over time. So I don't think that focusing on the single interval as kind of the argument for or against investment decisions is really the right starting point. I think this is just helpful from an illustrative point of saying, when you're running these higher cost resources, can you have a market price that accurately reflects that and ultimately over time encourages the right decisions to be made?
Thanks, Jeff. Can we go to Josh next?
Thanks again, Jeff, sorry, James. Josh Arnold, PG&E. Too many J names. I wanted to respond real quick to Jeff on a couple of those, and I also have a comment for Perry, I think in his favor. But for Jeff, in his original example, he mentioned having a third resource, a 40 megawatt import. And one thing I wanted to remind everyone is that the CAISO optimization looks at total cost over the entire range of its process. So if that resource, if that import could be brought in at $40 per megawatt, it would actually take the place of unit 2 because it's a cheaper unit. So long as it can meet the necessary megawatts that are needed, in this case 50 megawatts, that import would be dispatched before unit 2 ever got considered because it's cheaper. Unit 1 would be maxed out to 200 megawatts. The import would bring in its 50 megawatts at $40, and the LMP would be at $40. So under that example, unit 2 wouldn't even be brought in. It would be simply out of the money. It wouldn't be included. So I think the market is already doing what it's supposed to do when it has those different economic bids. Whereas if we were to follow Jeff's example fully, by setting the price at $50, that import is then incentivized actually to raise its bid price up to $49 to try to undercut unit 2. And since it's an import and can't be mitigated, it's going to basically just try to cut off unit 2 any chance it gets. So I'm not sure that the example of including an import really strengthens the argument for fast start pricing. I think it actually weakens it further. In relation to Perry's comments, I think he really is on the, hitting a nail on the head here in that if there's a price signal being sent at a location, let's say it's $50 at a specific point due to congestion prices and all the rest, people are going to look at what they can build in that location to try to take advantage of that. But what's missing is a dispatch quantity. If what you need is 1 megawatt at that location, okay, you can try to build a unit with 1 megawatt that's less than $50 per megawatt hour. But if you need to overcome this 75 megawatt PMIN or economic minimum, that's a whole different variable. Now you have to have more than that 75 megawatts at a lower price in order to offset this fast start resource. And you don't have that quantity information. So it feels like there's a metric missing there. And the only thing I would then add is under the current mechanism, unit 2 actually has incentive to now bring its minimum from 75 megawatts down to 50 megawatts so it can be dispatchable at that $50 price point, in which case it will set the LMP as it's intended to do because it will be the marginal unit. So I just think that we're dancing around these concepts without remembering the reality on the ground that we have right now, which is least cost dispatch, price formation based on dispatchable resources, because in this case, that 75 megawatt EMIN does not make that unit dispatchable. It's actually forcing us to reduce on a more economic unit. It's forcing us to back off on unit 1 because of this artificial limitation. So there's a lot of moving parts to this. And it's just, I'm not seeing a clear construct of why I should elevate my price when we do have cost recovery certainty. I'll just leave it at that and move on to the next caller. Thank you, though, James.
Thanks, Josh, for your perspective. Let's go to Petter, and then Perry, if you have a final comment, make it brief so I can get through the rest of the slides. Petter?
This is Petter from SGM. I think this is very important to make distinction between inflexible generations and so-called fast start when you are putting startup cost and minimum load cost into LMPs. CAISO already has something that we called constrained output generation pricing, which kind of make flexible these P means that are different than 0, but nobody's using that as far as I know. In the early days of MRTU, first few years, we did have schedules from scheduling run and prices from pricing run, and that caused a lot of problems. So CAISO had to switch to both schedules and prices coming of the pricing run, because there was inconsistency between dispatch megawatts and prices as a result of that. To implement this proposal, it would require to use schedules from scheduling run and prices from pricing run with all the inconsistencies. There is a lot of explanation about having accurate pricing, and accurate pricing has different meaning for net producers and net consumers. Net producers like Jeff and others, we always say that accurate pricing is to put this in the system, which will definitely result in much higher pricing than what we have today, without pretty much any good justification. Why would you do that? And I think some years ago, when this was discussed at FERC, we have to remember how this started. This didn't start to kind of have more accurate marginal prices. This started with PJM not covering with their capacity markets payments toward their generators, inflexible generators. And because of some low fuel cost resources coming on PJM system, those flexible generators were short of money. They call it missing money problem. That's why this is introduced, to keep those inflexible non-competitive generator alive in the system. It has nothing to do with accurate price. It is just purely to find that missing money. Now in the West, you have a lot of solar, you have a lot of wind, you have a lot of hydro. Those resources don't have that missing money problem. And I believe DMM in those comments when this discussed at FERC properly pointed out that introducing this into the system, you practically move from incremental cost-based pricing to average cost pricing. And you immediately can explain a point that Perry was making, because you're getting inaccurate incremental price from the system that is using average costing. And that's why you cannot use that as a long-term signal, because that cost may not be there if you enter with flexible unit. In his example, if you enter with $35 incremental unit, assuming that cost is going to be 50, you're going to push out this inflexible unit and price will be 35. So there is really no good reason to kind of explain why anybody should do this. What are you going to gain, except that net producers will have higher price and earn more money? Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, for your perspective. Perry, can you close us briefly?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief again. Perry Servideo, GDS. I just, I had completely forgotten, but I'm glad that Peter mentioned the whole actual history on fast start pricing, that it was really to go after the missing money from a screwed up capacity market, which we don't have in California. But I did want to just respond. One small thing to Jeff's comment is just that I want you to know that I understand where he's coming from the sense of reflecting the short-term operational needs, and we could spend years arguing about that. But I think in this instance, we have 6 principles that we're weighing against each other, and mentioning just one of the principles as the reason to just disregard, say, 3 others is probably a little bit far of a stretch here. That's my response. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Perry. I appreciate everybody's input and feedback. Okay, let's move on in the examples. I don't remember specifically what page. One more slide, I think. Yep. Okay, so this set of examples is going to build upon the previous one, only in the context now that we have commitment costs for both of these units. And so actually, really, the commitment cost of unit 1 is irrelevant in this example, but unit 2's commitment costs are going to be incorporated into the price through the fast start pricing method. So first, though, within the status quo, this is just today's market. We run through the same process of looking at the offers for these units and identifying how we should dispatch them to serve 250 megawatts of demand while minimizing the production costs. So next slide, please. We'd have the exact same dispatch as the previous example. And this is an example that was illustrated in workshop 1, so I won't belabor it too much, but the dollar signs next to the commitment costs just represent that the market is turning these resources from off to online. And of course, this is a simplified version of the concept of commitment cost, so bear with me. But by turning these resources on, the market has bared a commitment cost of $500 for each resource. But the point being that those commitment costs are irrelevant in setting the LMP in the market. We went over that in workshop 1, why that's true. So despite the fact that you have commitment costs to turn these resources on, the market price remains at $25 set by Unit 1. Next slide, please. So now starting with this example, we're going to capture the commitment cost, at least of Unit 2, within the price, the locational price that's set. So first, again, in terms of a scheduling run process, the scheduling run would determine the schedules for these resources, and the dispatch would be exactly the same because you're using the same supply curve for each resource as you did in the status quo to determine the optimal dispatch. Next slide, please. Now, with fast start pricing, we modify the supply curve of Unit 2 to demonstrate that the resources in the pricing run is dispatchable between 0 and 100. And we have the same, without incorporation of commitment costs, we saw in the last example that the marginal price would be set by Unit 2 in this example to $50. And again, the dispatch quantities in the pricing run are not binding prices, or binding dispatches. The dispatches would come from the scheduling run, but the pricing run would just determine the pricing that results from the dispatch. And then if we go to the next slide, what we do now in this slide is to say, now we're going to incorporate the commitment costs within the pricing using this method of sort of finding the incremental cost of Unit 2, which is $50, and adding in the commitment cost divided by the maximum output, which $500 divided by 100 megawatts is an additional $5, which sets the market price at $55. So the concept here being that, with a $55 market price, if we were to put out a table or a spreadsheet to compare this unit's cost relative to the market price it receives, $55 is sufficient, at least within this interval, to compensate Unit 2 both for its incremental cost of $50 and for its fixed cost, so that there is no uplift required to pay Unit 2 based on this market price. And then, of course, if we go back to one of the original arguments from the FERC NOPR that described the argument that if one considers Unit 2 to be a fast start resource, and these commitment costs are essentially born within the same interval that the incremental costs are born, that it may be appropriate to incorporate those commitment costs into the price to reflect the full cost of starting or committing and dispatching Unit 2 in the overall market price. I see a hand. Let's go to Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay Schluck with NV Energy. I just have a quick question. I was wondering, why is it divided by the max output and not the min? I guess because the min is 0 now with the fast start pricing, is that right?
Yeah, so to be fair, there's a variety of ways, different ways that the other ISOs incorporate commitment costs into the pricing. I'm not actually sure that any ISO uses this specific method, but it is essentially the concept is such that $55 is sufficient for Unit 2 to cover both its incremental and its fixed costs through the market price without requiring an uplift. And so this method of including the commitment cost over its max output accomplishes that, at least for this interval. And we will opine a little bit on one, how in a couple slides from now we'll opine on how long the commitment costs remain part of the price signal. For this, in this simple example, you only really need it to be part of this because we're only doing one interval at a time. It's simple enough to just keep it like this, but there's also, in terms of how other ISOs amortize the commitment costs, they also look at a time component too, potentially, where, if the, let's say this resource is operating for 4 hours, it has a minimum uptime of 4 hours, maybe those costs are amortized over a 4-hour period. So Mike's got his hand up. He wants to elaborate on my response. Go ahead, Mike.
And you're actually going to get to this in a couple, actually 2 slides, I think. But recall back at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about a couple of, we didn't call them principles exactly, but rules that the supply curve that's being used in the pricing run would need to follow. And one was that essentially that we don't want to artificially make the unit cheaper or more expensive. So when it's at Pmax, we want the cost under this alternate modified supply curve to be the same as it is under the true supply curve. Well, that means that at 100 megawatts, its cost has to be $5,500. 550 times 100 plus the $500 commitment. So we have to have a total of $5,500 of cost when we're at 100 megawatts, and we can't have a decrease in supply curve. With those 2 conditions together, the only way you can get to that is a $55 curve that goes from 0 to 100. That won't always be the case. There will be other examples, more complicated examples, where there are various alternate supply curves that could meet those 2 conditions. But in this simple example, if you want to keep supply curve that's used in the pricing dispatch, non-decreasing, which you need to have, and you don't want to artificially make the unit cheaper or more expensive, this is the only choice.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. And thanks, Mike. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the supply curves and the total cost curves of these unit 2 get a little more interesting in this example because we're incorporating the fixed costs. These are marginal cost curves or supply curves for the unit. You can see on the left-hand side, the scheduling run supply curve is exactly the same from the other example. But now the pricing run supply curve changes not only in the fact that you've extended the marginal cost curve to the origin, basically, or 0, but you've also actually increased the marginal cost from $50 to $55, such that the market would see, instead of, the resource would be submitting a bid for $50 incrementally, but the market would take that bid, modify the supply curve to look like the red one on the right, such that the market sees an offer of $55. Next slide, please. Similarly, with the total cost curve, you can see now with the inclusion of the fixed commitment costs, you have sort of raised the curve. I apologize, these aren't going to be completely to scale because I struggled with making them look harmonious between the 2 curves, so I apologize for that. But conceptually, what we're trying to show is that you've essentially, for the scheduling run, you've raised the total cost curve by some amount given the fixed costs. And then when you look on the right-hand side in the pricing run, you notice that the line in comparison to the scheduling run supply curve is steeper, which represents, the added marginal cost from the previous slide. But it's also, instead of starting the total cost curve at on the y-axis at $500, it sort of extends, takes that curve down to 0. And so the point also that Mike was trying to make is that and Lindsay's question sort of brought up is that the endpoints for these curves in terms of the Pmax are exactly the same. And, that's necessary to make sure that, the unit isn't represented to be more or less costly than it actually is at its Pmax. let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the last slide in the deck, and then we'll take some final questions. So some additional thoughts to think about after that example. Just a reminder in the first bullet that the idea behind including the commitment cost in the price is that because the thought goes that because the resource is committed roughly at the same time that the incremental energy costs are incurred, that you could think that because the incremental and the fixed costs are incurred at the same time, that both of those costs should be included within the market price to demonstrate what the additional, what the cost of serving the next increment of demand would be. So that's kind of the thinking there. The second sub-bullet shows, or second bullet is, you know, I've sort of prefaced this in the beginning, but the examples all the way through are assuming that unit 2 is an eligible fast start resource, which is why the market in the pricing run is able to modify its supply curve. Now, depending on how the ISO defines fast start resource, it could be the case that either one, both, or neither of these units in the example are modeled differently for pricing purposes. So, you know, I don't think it would have made a difference, but it's totally possible that both of the units in this example could be, you know, depending on their startup time, could be eligible fast start resources and could be modeled differently in the pricing run. Last thing that I just wanted to, I'll turn to Mike to sort of opine a little longer, but, you know, one question that comes up is, okay, so in this unit, or in this interval, we've incorporated the commitment costs into the LMP price signal. It has, you know, one of the benefits of that from unit 2's perspective is now the market price compensates that resource for its fixed and incremental costs within the LMP itself, so no uplift is needed to pay to compensate that resource. And arguably, you know, compensating that resource, the fixed cost through the market price is you know, potentially more transparent than having two prices, one of which is visible to the market and the uplift payment that's paid to the resource that's not visible to the market. But the question becomes, okay, well, if this resource is online for some period of time, how long or should the commitment costs remain within the LMP price signal? So I know that different ISOs have different methods for doing this, but maybe Mike can provide some insight into, you know, how the New York ISO would answer this question.
Sure. So really the question here is, you know, so you have in an example $500 in commitment costs, and one approach would be to say, gee, let's suppose those were startup costs. We weren't specific in the example, but let's suppose they were. Well, one approach would be to say, well, gee, I incurred $500 to start up a unit. It has to run for its minimum run time, so I'll allocate the $500 over the minimum run time. And that's an approach that you could use. But what is, you know, certainly often going to be the case is that why did you start the unit? Did you start it because, you know, suppose it's got a minimum runtime of an hour, and we have come to the question of exactly what qualifies as a fast start unit or no, what doesn't, but let's suppose it does. Well, you may have gone ahead and incurred that $500, but you didn't incur it really to meet load 45 minutes from now. You meant it to meet load, you committed it to meet load in the next 15 minutes. That's when you really need it. You're going to go ahead and let it run for an hour because that's its minimum runtime, but you committed it to meet load in the next 15 minutes. Well, in that case, that's an argument that says that, you know, it would make sense in that case to go ahead and actually allocate the majority, perhaps all of the commitment costs to the, you know, the next 15 minutes, the period in which you really went ahead and needed the unit. What's done in New York is something that is basically based on that sort of an analysis. But, you know, and, you know, there's also, of course, the possibility of, I think it's going to be less frequent, but you can imagine a situation where a unit has large startup costs, but once you started it, you know what, it's a quick start unit. I started it, but once it's going, I might as well leave it on for a few hours. In that case, that might be an argument to go ahead and allocate the commitment costs over a longer period, even exceeding its minimum runtime. Again, that's probably going to be less likely the case for a quick start unit, but it's certainly not impossible. So there are all sorts of interesting questions that can be assessed as to exactly over what, how do we allocate those commitment costs? Over what, in which interval should we be expecting to recover them? And so when we go back to the, what we were talking about earlier in the presentation about the idea that the modified supply curve that is used in the pricing dispatch should cover the costs. What we, intentionally didn't get into at that point was the detail of, well, what about these costs that aren't clearly identified with a particular interval? And so we have to answer that question. Once we've answered it, then we can go ahead and say that, gee, the supply curve that is defined for interval 1 or interval 2 or interval 3 should recover not just the cost of operating in that interval, but also the share of like startup costs that have been allocated to that.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, in the example, because we're only dealing with a single interval at a time, we can recover all of the fixed costs within a single interval. But it could be the case that, like as Mike said, if you have a resource with minimum runtime of 4 hours, that the resource can still recover its fixed costs through the price if you allocate the fixed costs over a 4-hour period. And so maybe the incremental price change might be, if you have the same quantity of fixed costs in one instance, you're amortizing them over a longer period, then the relative change in price will be smaller, but recovered over a longer period. And the opposite would be, you could, if you're just going to amortize them over the startup costs, then the relative market price will maybe be higher, but that's because you're recovering those costs in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, just to be clear, James, in my example, the minimum time was still short. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't qualify as a fast start unit. I'm going to guess. But the question, even if it's got a minimum runtime of an hour, well, it still might be economic to operate for more than an hour, depending upon its actual bid parameters, whatever other alternatives you have available. And so, just because you have to run it for an hour, you still might elect to run it for 4 hours. And if that, in fact, is the reason why you committed it, well, that could be an argument for saying that you want to allocate those commitment costs over the 4-hour period because you committed it. You incurred the relatively large startup costs for this example because, once it's running, I can keep it going for 4 hours and it's worth it. So that's probably a less likely scenario. Probably the more likely scenario is that you commit to fast start units because you want them right now. But those are it could go both ways. There are situations where it might make sense to allocate the startup costs over a shorter period than the minimum runtime, and situations where it might make sense to do it over a longer than the minimum.
Thanks. Let's go to Petter on the phone.
James Petter again from SGM. If you implement this, you'll have inconsistency between scheduling and pricing run. In an effort to minimize that inconsistency, it's probably the best to use this cost only the first interval that is unit starting, because that's how is done in scheduling run. If you kind of spread it into minimum runtime, it's going to create additional inconsistency between scheduling and pricing run. I would like to remind everybody that currently startup cost and minimum load cost are done to bid cost recovery process, which I believe is the daily. And this would be realized in every interval. It's not going to be netting over the day. So that will be significant increase of market costs that you are kind of going to be exposed. There is a kind of mythology about this approach minimizing uplift, which is kind of misleading big time, because uplift is not minimized. It is just moved from bid cost recovery, from make whole payments into LMPs. And then there is another uplift that was not there introduced, that you talk about that earlier, when you have to pay people not to chase the price of the system. So there are multiple impacts of this change that are going to significantly increase the cost of system operation. And places like PJM were talking about this and seeing, okay, how do we deal with this because the additional cost? And they had some discussion, like, for example, since we have centralized capacity market, We'll see how people get extra in day-ahead energy markets, and we're going to reduce their payments and so on and so forth. Managing that is kind of impossible task to do. So if you implement something like this, cost will be definitely much higher than what you read out there, like 3-5%. Market cost will be higher, and I cannot think about any load-serving entity that will, see any value of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so this is the end of the material. I'll just maybe if I want to take any last questions or comments before we wrap it up. Go ahead, Perry.
Perry Servideo, GDS. I just have one small thing. I think it's on page 23. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this right. So you've taken all of the commitment costs and you've kind of basically just amortized them over the maximum output of the unit, and then that raises it up to the $55. Is that how that works?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, so sorry for the nit here. I would just label that chart on the right to say average cost rather than marginal cost. That's all.
Thanks. Yeah, to be
Actually,
maybe
yeah.
to be. Go ahead,
I
Mike.
think, I mean, it is the marginal cost that is used in the pricing run. I mean, it is what we do is we have to model a supply curve that is used in the pricing run, and it is modeled as though it has a $55 cost to go from 0 to its Pmax.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. That maybe even better way of describing it is these curves are intending to show what the market sees as. Another way to think about it is the left-hand side is the actual submitted bid, and the right-hand side is the modified bid as seen in the pricing run. The market is using to determine prices.
Yeah, I'd agree with describing it that way, but you can't call it marginal cost. That's all. I mean, that just doesn't meet the textbook definition of marginal cost.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Okay, well then, thanks, Mike, for your help, and I appreciate your insights, and I appreciate everybody following along. Do expect a third workshop in this series to take place sometime in January, where we can make the examples a little more complicated and more fun. But with that, I hope everybody has a happy holiday, and I'll turn it over to Brenda.
Thank you, James. Great job to our ISO team. Thank you to Michael for his analysis and help in contribution to the slides. And thank you to our stakeholders who provided feedback. We appreciate it, as this technical workshop was recorded and will be posted next week. And we thank you all for joining us on a Friday. And just a reminder that all information will be posted on the website, and we do have the slides available to you today. And if you do have any questions coming up, please send them over to isostakeholderaffairs@kaizo.com. And then lastly but not least, happy holidays and take care, everyone. And sending back to Silas to close our meeting. Thank you.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.